Hey guys, tonight we begin with the daily lives of the people who built one of the longest lasting civilizations in human history, and with a very strange gap between how they painted themselves and what their days actually looked like. Ancient Egypt left behind more physical evidence of its daily existence than almost any culture that preceded it. Some of that evidence is exactly what you might expect: temples, papyrus, and hieroglyphics carved so deep into stone that they are still legible 4,000 years later. And some of it is a razor, a gold one placed deliberately in a royal tomb, waiting for whatever came next. It is a small detail. It is also one of the more revealing things about how a civilization understood itself and its priorities. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We are in ancient Egypt now, not the Egypt of cinema, not the Egypt of golden light and cinematic sandstorms, but the Egypt where the most common object recovered from royal tombs is a razor. The civilization has been continuous for roughly 3,000 years at this point. Its painters have been covering limestone walls with images of perfectly proportioned people in very specific colours, and its barbers are among the most respected professionals in the known world. None of this is coincidental. It will take a few minutes to explain why. Egyptian artists painted men with reddish, brown skin and women with white or pale yellow skin. They did this consistently, across dynasties, across centuries, across the full geographic span of a civilization that stretched from the Nile Delta to the Fourth Cataract and beyond. The convention did not waver when a pharaoh with notably lighter features sat on the throne. It did not waver when a woman became pharaoh who received the same reddish-brown pigment as any man. Because the pigment was not describing the person, the pigment was describing the category. The logic of Egyptian art was not the logic of a portrait, it was the logic of a statement. Egyptian painters were not attempting to record what a person looked like on a particular afternoon in a particular light, with particular shadows falling across a particular face. They were establishing, in a medium that would outlast any individual life, what a person fundamentally was. And what a man fundamentally was, in Egyptian visual ideology, was the colour of a body that worked outdoors, reddish, brown, active, present in the sunlit world. What a woman fundamentally was, in that same system, was the colour of an interior life, pale yellow or white, associated with shade and enclosure and the domestic sphere. This same convention appeared in Minoan frescoes on the island of Crete. It appeared in archaic Greek pottery. It was not an Egyptian invention, so much as a shared visual grammar across several Bronze Age Mediterranean cultures, a syntax of painted gender that multiple civilizations arrived at independently or borrowed from one another through the same trade routes that moved copper and cedar and obsidian. Whether the Minoans learned it from Egypt, or Egypt from the Minoans, or both inherited it from someone whose walls have not survived, is a question the archaeological record has so far declined to answer. What is clear is that the system had nothing to do with individual pigmentation. The same painter who depicted his pharaoh in the prescribed reddish, brown would have depicted that pharaoh's foreign wife in the prescribed pale yellow, regardless of whether the pharaoh happened to be lighter, skinned in life, or the wife darker, or both somewhere between the two poles the convention had established. The paint was not describing a person. It was assigning a person to a category that had been determined long before the painter picked up his brush and would remain fixed long after he set it down. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. We are accustomed to thinking of visual images as documentary, as something that at least attempts to record what was there. The Egyptian painters were not attempting this. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it with remarkable precision and consistency across a span of time that makes most modern institutions look briefly experimental. The result is a visual record that tells us a great deal about how Egyptian society understood itself, and almost nothing about what any particular Egyptian actually looked like standing outside in the afternoon sun. The ochre dust would have settled on everything in a painter's workshop, on the stone grinding bowls, on the cloth stretched across the mixing palette, on the floor and the walls and the back of the painter's hands. The gypsum plaster on the tomb walls dried in a particular way, slightly chalky at the surface, and the painter would have known exactly how long he had before the wall stopped accepting colour. The oil lamps kept the chamber lit, and kept it warm and slightly close with the smell of burning sesame. Outside, the city went about its business. Inside, the official version of the world took shape in ochre and white and charcoal, brushstroke by brushstroke, exactly as it had for 3,000 years. The implications of this system become clearest in a single specific example, which involves an Egyptian official named Hekenefer. Hekenefer served during the reign of Tutankhamun in the 18th dynasty. He was the Prince of Mayam, a region in Nubia, which meant he was a local ruler who had been absorbed into the Egyptian administrative structure, educated in Egyptian customs, given Egyptian titles, embedded in the Egyptian court. By any practical measure, he was part of the Egyptian world. He spoke its language, moved through its institutions, and had a tomb of his own cut into the rock in the south. In his own tomb, he was depicted exactly as one would expect an Egyptian official of his rank to be depicted. He appeared in the standard reddish brown of an Egyptian man, wearing Egyptian clothing and holding Egyptian ritual objects, rendered in the proportions and style that Egyptian artists had been using for centuries. His tomb presented him as an Egyptian because, in the context of his own tomb, that was his primary identity. A man of standing within the Egyptian hierarchy. He also appeared in the tomb of Hu, who was the Egyptian viceroy of Nubia. And in Huai's tomb, Hekenefer appeared in a procession of tribute, bearers from the south, depicted with a darker skin tone, and different dress, and the visual markers that the Egyptian artistic system used to categorize a Nubian foreigner. Same man, same period of history, different tomb, different pigment, different person. Hekenefer had two official portraits, and they were, in any meaningful sense, portraits of two different people. He did not appear to object to this arrangement, or if he did, no record of the objection has survived. The Egyptians who made both sets of images did not appear to find this contradictory, because in their visual logic it was not. Context determined category. In your own tomb, you were what your status said you were. In someone else's narrative, you were what their story required you to be. This is not falsification in the sense a modern observer would mean. It is something older and stranger, a representational system, so thoroughly grounded in meaning, rather than appearance, that the question of whether an image matched a person would have seemed, to the people producing it, somewhat beside the point. The point was never to show what Hekenefer looked like. The point was to show where he stood in relation to everything else. His own tomb showed him standing in Egyptian space. Hui's tomb showed him standing in the space of tribute and foreign relation. Both images were, within their own terms, completely accurate. The plaster on Hui's tomb walls is still intact in the places where the images survive. The colours have faded slightly across the centuries, the richer pigments losing some of their depth, the whites going slightly yellow with age. But the underlying structure remains visible. The hierarchy of figures, the careful spacing, the procession moving in the prescribed direction toward the viceroy who waits at the far edge of the frame. Hekenefer is somewhere in that procession, in his assigned colours, carrying his assigned tribute, occupying exactly the position the painter needed him to occupy. He looks, from a distance of 3,000 years, exactly like what he was required to be, which is perhaps the most accurate thing that can be said about him, and perhaps the least. The colour-coding system extended outward from Egypt in every direction, assigning visual categories to every neighbouring nation the Egyptians recognised. Libyans who lived to the northwest were traditionally depicted with pale skin and blue eyes and tattoos and feathers in their hair, a package of visual markers that said, in the painted shorthand of the Egyptian system, this person is from the west and is categorized accordingly. Nubians who lived to the south were depicted with very dark skin and gold jewellery and tribute goods. The visual language of a people Egypt maintained a complex relationship with, alternately trading with, ruling over, and being ruled by. Canaanites and Levantine peoples from the northeast received a lighter yellow-brown skin tone and distinctive clothing that set them apart from the reddish-brown Egyptian baseline. The visual taxonomy was comprehensive. Egyptian painters had, over centuries, developed something like a chromatic map of the known world, a system in which your geographic origin could be read from your painted skin tone. the way a modern reader might read a flag or a passport. The system was not random, and it was not arbitrary. It was a deliberate encoding of geopolitical relationships in the most permanent medium available. What the system was not doing, once again, was observing. Egyptian painters who depicted Libyans with pale skin were not working from careful documentation of Libyan complexions. They were placing Libyans in the position the visual system had assigned them, to the pale end of the chromatic spectrum, which corresponded to the western end of the geographic spectrum, which corresponded to a particular political relationship with Egypt. The observed reality of any particular Libyan standing in front of the painter was, in the strictest sense, not the point. This creates a peculiar situation for modern readers trying to reconstruct what ancient Egyptian society actually looked like. The art is everywhere. The tomb paintings are among the best preserved visual records from any ancient civilization. Detailed, numerous, and remarkably vivid even after 3,000 years of darkness and dust. And they tell you, with complete consistency, what the Egyptian visual system required people to look like, which is a very different kind of information from what any of those people actually looked like. The tribute bearers march across the lower registers of 100 tomb walls, each group carrying the appropriate goods, wearing the appropriate clothing, displaying the appropriate skin tone. The cedar arrives from the northeast in the hands of Canaanites in yellow-brown. The gold arrives from the south in the hands of Nubians in deep brown. The livestock arrives from the northwest in the hands of pale Libyans in feathered headdresses. It is very orderly. It is very clear. It is, in the most precise possible sense, a picture of what Egypt wanted its world to look like, organized, legible, and correctly colored. Among all the physical objects that have survived from ancient Egypt, the stone vessels, the wooden furniture, the amulets and shaptis and canopic jars, one of the most common finds in excavations of royal and elite burials is the razor. They appear in copper, in bronze, in gold. They appear in simple forms and in elaborate forms, with handles carved from wood or bone or ivory, with blades honed to an edge that metal workers of the period had to practice for years to achieve consistently. They appear in burials across multiple dynasties and multiple social levels, from the most elaborate royal preparations to the more modest kits of middle-ranking officials. The razor was, apparently, essential, too essential to leave behind when a person departed for whatever came after. This tells you something. It tells you that grooming was not a luxury or an afterthought in ancient Egypt. It was so fundamental to how a person presented themselves in the world, and apparently in the afterlife, that the tools for it were considered as necessary to a complete burial as food offerings or ritual texts. The razor was not a vanity item. It was a statement about what a prepared person looked like and what a prepared person required. Most elite Egyptians shaved, the body hair, the facial hair, the head hair, all of it removed, regularly, with those copper and bronze and gold blades, in a process that required skill and frequency and access to someone who knew what they were doing. The barber, in ancient Egypt, was not a peripheral figure. Text from multiple periods reference barbers operating in urban centres, maintaining regular clientele, working with tools expensive enough to be marked by their owners and valuable enough to be passed down. A well-maintained razor, in a society without stainless steel, represented a real investment in both the object and the person who used it. Coal, the dark pigment made from ground galena or lead sulfide, appeared alongside the razor as a standard part of the Egyptian grooming kit. It lined the eyes in the deep lack that appears on virtually every face in Egyptian painting, elite and common alike. The coal had practical purposes in a desert climate. The dark pigment reduced glare and may have offered some protection against eye infections common in environments with limited clean water. It also had religious significance, associated with the Eye of Horus, with protection and divine oversight. And it looked, by the standards of a culture that had been refining its aesthetic sense for 3,000 years, exactly the way they wanted it to look. The grooming was both practical and ideological, like almost everything in Egypt. The clean-shaved body, the lined eye, the carefully maintained appearance was part of the same system that painted men reddish, brown, and women pale yellow. Appearance was a statement. Appearance was a category. Appearance was something you prepared for every morning, and apparently arranged to have available in whatever came after morning. The razors in the tombs are small things, a few inches of polished metal, easily overlooked among the more spectacular grave goods. But they sit in the display cases of museums with a specific kind of directness. They are not symbolic. They are not decorative. They are exactly what they look like, the tools a person used to maintain themselves, packed carefully for a journey no one has yet returned from to confirm the necessity. The head that all this shaving revealed was not, in public, left bare. Wigs in ancient Egypt were not a theatrical prop or an eccentric fashion choice. They were a standard element of dressed appearance for elite Egyptians and for a broad swath of the population across multiple social levels. The natural hair was shaved or cropped close. What replaced it in public was an artificial construction. Linen threads woven into human hair, or human hair alone, worked into the elaborate shapes that appear in painting and sculpture, so consistently that it is easy to forget they are not the person's actual hair. The wigs were expensive, stratified, and meaningful. The most elaborate ones, the full, heavy, multi-layered constructions worn by high-ranking men and women in formal contexts, required skilled labor to produce and careful maintenance to preserve. They were oiled with perfumed fats, among them kifi, an Egyptian aromatic compound whose recipe has survived in enough variations to suggest it was blended differently by different perfumers across different periods. The smell of kifi, resins, wine, myrrh, honey, would have been part of the sensory presentation of an elite Egyptian in formal dress, the wig and the oil and the caul arriving together as a complete and deliberate package. The logic here is consistent with everything else in Egyptian visual and social practice. Your natural hair was, in some sense, private, the personal biological fact of your body, present under the wig but not on display. What you presented to the world in formal and professional contexts was the constructed version, shaped, oiled, maintained, controlled. The wig was who you were, in public, in the same way that the reddish-brown pigment on the tomb wall was who you were in the official record. This distinction between the private biological fact and the public constructed presentation runs through Egyptian culture in ways that remain interesting across the distance of millennia. The body that existed in daily life was real. The body that mattered for purposes of record and representation was the body as it appeared through deliberate acts of maintenance and convention. The painter's color code, the shaved head, the wig, the caul. All of it was part of the same project of constructing a legible public self in a culture that took legibility very seriously. The wigs have survived, some of them. There are examples in museum collections, linen and human hair, still holding their shape after 3,000 years in the dry heat of a sealed tomb. They are stranger objects than the razors, somehow. The razors are familiar, small, functional, clearly tools. The wigs are something else, the constructed surface of a person, preserved without the person inside them. They sit in their cases shaped like a head that is no longer there, retaining the impression of an appearance that was, in any case, the constructed version, the formal version, the version prepared every morning before the day began and packed by some careful hand for the afterlife, alongside the razor, because wherever you were going, you would need to look the part. There is a paradox at the center of Egyptian hair culture, and it takes a moment to notice. The people who shaved their hair off, or had it shaved off with those copper and bronze blades, as part of the daily presentation of a properly maintained Egyptian self, wrote, in their poetry, with great feeling and specificity, about hair, not about wigs. About hair, the natural kind, the kind they spent considerable effort removing. Ramesside era love poetry, text from the 19th and 20th dynasties, roughly 13 to 12 centuries before the Common Era, is more explicitly erotic than its surviving reputation might suggest. One poem from the collection known as the Chester Beatty Papyrus describes a woman using her hair as the instrument of capture. She casts a kind of net with it, snares the speaker, draws him toward her across the distance between them. The hair is not decorative in these poems, it is active. It is the thing that does the work. The word for widow in ancient Egyptian, the term that scribes rendered in hieroglyphics, was written with a hair determinative, a small pictorial sign associated with hair, attached to the word to clarify its semantic category. This is a standard feature of the hieroglyphic system, in which abstract or ambiguous words are accompanied by a sign that locates the word within a broader field of meaning. The word for widow was located by the scribes who standardized this system in the field of hair. What exactly this connection meant, whether widowhood was associated with uncovered or disheveled hair, whether hair was a marker of social status that changed at widowhood, or whether the association operated on some deeper symbolic level, is not entirely clear from the surviving texts. But the connection was deliberate, and it was stable across the written record. What the love poems and the hieroglyphic system share is an understanding of hair as something charged, with desire, with social meaning, with status. The civilization that shaved its hair and covered the result with an elaborate oiled wig had not lost its awareness of what hair meant. It had simply moved that meaning into a different register, the private register of the body, and the literary register of poetry, and the grammatical register of the script itself. The wig was the official version. The hair was everything. The official version was keeping quiet. Egyptian love poetry is not gentle in the way the word ancient sometimes implies. It is direct. The Chester Beatty poems use the body as their primary territory, the heart that pounds, the eye that catches, the hair that snares, and they assume a reader who understands that territory without needing it explained. They were written by scribes, for scribes, in the New Kingdom tradition of literary composition. That the content is erotic rather than religious, or administrative, tells you something about what educated New Kingdom Egyptians considered worth writing down when no one was requiring them to write anything in particular. It also tells you something about what all those carefully constructed, officially maintained, wig, wearing call, lined people were thinking about under the official version. Egyptian scribes wrote fiction. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the more interesting things about them. The tradition is older than the New Kingdom. Papyri from the Middle Kingdom already contain narrative texts that read as entertainment, rather than religious or administrative content. But it is in the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, that Egyptian literary fiction reaches its most developed form. The scribes who produced these texts were educated men, employed primarily in administrative and religious roles, writing literature as a form of professional demonstration or private pleasure. They were writing because they wanted to, or because it impressed someone whose opinion mattered. Among the surviving texts is the tale of two brothers, preserved on the Dorbani papyrus, and dated to roughly the reign of Seti, around 1200 BCE. It is a strange text in the way that early fiction often is several narratives nested inside each other, with mythological and domestic elements sitting alongside one another without apparent friction. It begins as a household story. Two brothers live and work together. The elder is married. The younger is not. While the elder brother is away working the fields, his wife attempts to seduce the younger brother. He refuses. She fabricates an accusation. He flees, is eventually vindicated, and the story then proceeds into territory involving magic and transformation that takes it well away from the domestic world where it began. Readers familiar with the Hebrew Bible will recognize the structure of the first episode. A woman propositions a man, is refused, and fabricates an accusation. This is the same structure as the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis, a text generally dated to a later period than the Dorbani papyrus. The relationship between the two has been debated for over a century. The Egyptian story may have influenced the biblical narrative through the channels of trade and cultural contact that connected Egypt to the Levant throughout the New Kingdom, or both may draw on a much older narrative template that predates both texts and has not survived in a recoverable form. Or the similarity may be the kind that emerges independently when writers in separate traditions are working with similar human situations. All three possibilities have been argued by serious scholars. None has been definitively ruled out. What is clear is that the Egyptian scribe who wrote the tale of two brothers was working with material that was not particular to any single culture or period. He was writing about things that happen between people. He was doing it with craft and a sense of narrative structure in a text that was copied and recopied across generations, which suggests that readers found it worth preserving. It is, in all the ways that matter, a piece of fiction. It was written to be read. The fact that it is 3,000 years old does not change that. Set against all of this, the colour conventions, the grooming rituals, the wigs and the poetry and the scribal fiction, is the actual city, not the city on the tomb walls, where everyone has been assigned their appropriate pigment and their appropriate role in the procession. The actual city, the places where people lived, worked, traded, prayed, argued, and went about the ordinary business of existence in a civilization that was, from the late Middle Kingdom onward, one of the most cosmopolitan places in the ancient world. From roughly 2000 BC onward, Egypt was a destination, the Nile Delta in particular, the broad, marshy, river-branched area where the Nile spreads before meeting the Mediterranean, was a point of intersection between Egypt and the wider world. By the Second Intermediate Period, the city of Avaris in the Delta had become the capital of the Hyksos, rulers of Levantine origin who governed Lower Egypt for roughly a century before being expelled by the 18th dynasty pharaohs, who went on to produce Tutankhamun and Hatshepsut and Akhenaten. The Hyksos introduced the horse and chariot to Egypt. They brought new bronze, working techniques and a range of practices from the Levant. They were, in the most straightforward sense, foreign. They were also in charge for a while, and they left their mark. By the New Kingdom, the period when the tomb paintings were at their most elaborate, when the official art was most insistently encoding its colour conventions, the actual population of Egyptian cities included Canaanite merchants who had been living in Egypt for generations and worshipped Canaanite deities in temples built alongside Egyptian ones. It included Nubian soldiers and administrators who served in the Egyptian military and bureaucracy. It included Aegean craftspeople, potters and fresco painters and metal workers from the Minoan and Mycenaean world, whose work has been identified in Egyptian contexts by the distinctly Aegean style of its execution. It included Cypriot traders, Syrian horse dealers, Libyan cattle herders, and people from further east and further south, whose presence is attested by objects, by administrative records, and by the occasional tomb painting that captures a detail the official style did not require, but a careful observer included anyway. None of this appears in the standard artistic taxonomy. The Canaanite merchant who had been living in Memphis for 30 years, whose children spoke Egyptian as a first language, did not have an official category. The Aegean fresco painter, whose work decorates the walls of a New Kingdom palace, does not appear in the procession of tribute bearers. Her work does, but she herself has been absorbed into the anonymous record of people who produced Egyptian things and were therefore, by the logic of the system, Egyptian. The city was considerably more complicated than the painting. It was louder, more varied, more contested, and more interesting than the official version that covered the tomb walls in orderly columns of correctly coloured figures. The smell of cedar from Levantine ships mixed in the harbour with the smell of dried fish and Egyptian grain and Nubian incense. Languages crossed in the market without anyone particularly caring about the colour, coding of the people speaking them. The official version was magnificent. The unofficial version was alive. The most significant test of the Egyptian visual system came not from the people it assigned to its various foreign categories, but from one of those categories, ascending to rule Egypt itself. In 747 BCE, a Kushite king named Pai marched north from the kingdom of Kush. The Nubian civilization centered on the Upper Nile south of Egypt's traditional borders, and conquered Egypt. The dynasty he founded, the 25th, ruled for roughly a century. Its pharaohs were, in the terms of the Egyptian artistic taxonomy, people who belonged to the category of southern peoples, depicted in the conventional darker pigment positioned in the tribute processions. Assigned their role as outsiders in the visual language, the Egyptian painters had been maintaining for 3,000 years. What they did with the apparatus of that language, once they controlled Egypt, was to step inside it entirely. The Kushite pharaohs depicted themselves in the full canonical regalia of Egyptian kingship: the double crown, the crook and flail, the false beard, the frontal profile composite posture that Egyptian sculptors had applied to royal subjects across every preceding dynasty. They built in the Egyptian architectural style, wrote in hieroglyphics, patronized the Egyptian priesthood, and commissioned the same kinds of monumental art that Egyptian pharaohs had been commissioning since the Old Kingdom. They presented themselves not as foreign rulers who had adopted local custom, but as the authentic continuation of pharaonic tradition, in some of their inscriptions, explicitly as a restoration of genuine Egyptian values that preceding dynasties had allowed to erode. The result is a body of royal imagery that is, by any visual examination, indistinguishable from the imagery of any other Egyptian dynasty. The Kushite pharaoh Taharqa, who built extensively at Karnak and whose monuments survive in considerable quantity, appears in statuary and relief work exactly as a canonical Egyptian pharaoh appears, proportioned correctly, posed correctly, crowned correctly, facing the correct direction in the prescribed composite profile. The conventions used to depict Nubians as tribute, bearing outsiders in the lower registers of earlier tomb walls, were not applied to the king. Those conventions had never been about what anyone looked like. They had been about what category a person occupied. The king occupied the highest category. The painting reflected that. The rest was irrelevant. The 25th dynasty was ended by Assyrian invasion in the 670s BCE, and the Kushite pharaohs retreated south. The monuments Taharqa had built at Karnak remained, standing beside the monuments of his predecessors in the same temple complex, in the same architectural language. His name remained in the records. The visual system absorbed a century of Kushite rule as it had absorbed everything else, by assigning the occupants of the royal position the visual treatment appropriate to that position, and then continuing. For the purposes of the official record, the category mattered. Who filled it was, within certain limits, a secondary consideration. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt. He was welcomed by many accounts as a liberator from Persian rule, made the required offerings at the great temples, visited the oracle at Siwa Oasis in the western desert, founded the city that would carry his name at the mouth of the Western Nile branch, and left. He never returned to Egypt in his lifetime. He died in Babylon 9 years later, and Egypt passed to one of his generals. That general was Ptolemy, who declared himself Ptolemy I Sota, king of Egypt, and established the dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Macedonian Greek in origin, culture, language, and self-conception. They built temples in the Egyptian style. The great sanctuaries at Edfu and Dendera, among the best preserved ancient Egyptian temples still standing, were built under Ptolemaic patronage, and they took Egyptian royal titles and depicted themselves in Egyptian artistic conventions. In the official visual record, they were pharaohs. In the palace at Alexandria, they spoke Greek. In the courts and bureaucracy, they governed in Greek. For the first 2.5 centuries of their rule, Greek was the language of Egyptian power, and the people who held that power did not, for the most part, learn the language of the country they governed. This was not unusual. The ancient world had a different relationship to linguistic identity than the modern one. An administrator governed in his administration's language. Interpreters and bilingual scribes handled the necessary translation. The Ptolemaic kings could patronize Egyptian religion, commission Egyptian art, take Egyptian titles, and present themselves as Egyptian rulers in every visual register, without ever speaking to their subjects in their subjects' language. The system worked. The temples got built. The grain got taxed. Cleopatra VII, who came to power in 51 BCE, was the first member of her dynasty to learn Egyptian. She reportedly spoke 9 languages in total, including Ethiopic, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, and Latin. And ancient sources record that she could address representatives of all these peoples without an interpreter. By the standards of the ancient world, this was remarkable enough to be worth noting, which means it was rare enough that noting was necessary. None of her predecessors of the same name had learned the language. The dynasty had governed Egypt for 250 years by the time Cleopatra VII took the trouble to learn what Egyptians actually said when they spoke. She was the last pharaoh after her death in 30 BCE. Egypt became a Roman province, and the 3,000-year tradition of pharaonic kingship, the double crown, the false beard, the prescribed posture, the official pigment, and all the rest of it, ended. What it ended with was a woman born into a Greek-speaking Macedonian dynasty who had learned 9 languages and governed with considerable political skill, and who appears in the Egyptian visual record as exactly what the conventions required, in the correct position, wearing the correct regalia, facing the correct direction. The system rendered her as a pharaoh. She was the last one it would render as anything. In the 1st century CE, roughly 100 years after Egypt became a Roman province, a funerary tradition emerged in the Fayum region, southwest of Cairo. The tradition involved painting a portrait of the deceased on a wooden panel, using the encaustic technique in which pigment is mixed with warm beeswax and applied while fluid, and placing it over the face of the mummy in the linen wrappings. The portraits were made to resemble the specific individual they represented. They were personal, in a way that Egyptian funerary art had rarely been personal. Not the official category, not the prescribed pigment, not the gender code or the geographic taxonomy. The specific face of the specific person. They are, as objects, startling. They look directly at the viewer with an immediacy that most ancient art does not achieve. Eyes large and dark and forward, facing painted with a directness that reads, across 2,000 years, as the presence of a specific person who once sat for this portrait in a room somewhere in Roman Egypt. The complexions range across a wide spectrum. Some faces are very dark, some olive, some lighter, some with reddish undertones, some a cool brown. The hair is shown as it was, curled, straight, close, cropped, elaborately dressed. There is no system of official pigmentation being applied. There is no convention by gender or geography. There are just people painted as they looked for the practical purpose of identification and the private purpose of remembrance. DNA analysis of ancient Egyptian mummies, conducted primarily on samples from the Abuser El Milek site, found that ancient Egyptians were most closely related to Neolithic and Bronze Age populations of the Levant, with substantially less sub-Saharan African ancestry than modern Egyptians carry. Modern Egyptians show greater African admixture, reflecting 2,000 years of subsequent population movement. The ancient Egyptians were, genetically, a Levantine, adjacent North African population, consistent with their geography, with their cosmopolitan history, and with the Fayum portrait's wide range of features and tones. None of this resolves into a single face. Egypt across 3,000 years was not a single people. It was a civilization, a political and cultural project sustained across an extraordinary span of time by institutions, conventions, rituals, and a visual system that organized the world into legible categories, and held those categories firmly in place while the actual world continued, as actual worlds do, to be considerably more varied than the categories could contain. The Fayum portraits are the exception. They are the moment when the personal version and the official record briefly coincided, when the face that had been living in the city and paying its taxes and speaking its language and being assigned its category was painted. For once, simply as it was, they looked like people you could have met, which, at some point, someone did. There is a painter somewhere in this story, a craftsman loading his brush with ochre, smoothing the first stroke across the damp surface of a tomb wall, who knew exactly what he was doing and why. He was not recording what he saw. He was making the world legible. He was placing each person in the correct category, assigning each nation its correct colour, encoding the hierarchy that made sense of everything, so that anyone who entered the tomb chamber and looked at the walls would understand, without being told, exactly what order the world was in. This was his work. He was very good at it. Tonight, most of us carry a camera in a pocket, capable of producing an image more accurate than anything he could have imagined. We use it constantly. We take hundreds of photographs and discard most of them, keeping the ones that show us as we wish to appear, in the preferred light, at the chosen angle, presenting the version we have decided to offer to the record. We curate, we construct, we assign ourselves, very carefully, to the correct category. The painter at the tomb wall and the person deciding which photograph to keep are separated by several thousand years and are doing something recognizably similar. The medium has changed. The impulse has not. The official version of a person has never been the same as the person. It is, however, what survives, what circulates, what history eventually records as the truth. The gap between the official image and the lived reality is not an Egyptian problem. It is a human one. The most honest thing about Egyptian art may be that it never pretended to be a photograph. Rome, 1480. The city was drenched in incense and intrigue in roughly equal measure, and the difference between the two was largely a matter of which door you entered. Into this world was born Lucrezia Borgia, illegitimate daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, a cardinal of enormous ambition who was, at the time of her birth, still 12 years away from purchasing the papacy. Her mother was Vanozza di Catane, a Roman woman of standing, one of several long-term companions. Rodrigo maintained with the quiet discretion that the Church of the 15th century extended to its more powerful members. Lucrezia was acknowledged, kept close, and raised in her father's household after her parents' arrangement wound to a close. She grew up in rooms that smelled of beeswax and parchment, in the particular warmth that wealthy Roman households generated through proximity to power. She was educated in the way that daughters of influential men were educated, when those men had specific plans for them: Latin, music, dancing, poetry, the management of household accounts, and the social intelligence required to move gracefully through courts and palaces without appearing to calculate anything at all. The education was excellent preparation for a life at court. It was somewhat less useful preparation for the actual life she would be required to live. Contemporary accounts describe her as fair-haired, pleasant in manner, and possessed of a composure that made her appear older than she was. She was, from early childhood, decorative in the way that daughters of the powerful were expected to be decorative, charming, presentable, arranged. What she thought about this arrangement is not recorded. In 1492, Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander V, after an election that contemporaries noted had involved an unusual level of financial persuasion. Lucrezia was 12. The implications of her father's new position were immediate and practical. She was no longer simply the cardinal's daughter. She was the Pope's daughter, a title without formal precedent in diplomatic protocol, but one that everyone in Rome understood exactly. In the political mathematics of Renaissance Italy, this made her considerably more valuable and considerably less her own. It also meant that the men who came to negotiate her marriages would be doing so not as suitors, exactly, but as investors. She was 13 when her first marriage was arranged. The groom was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a minor nobleman from a prominent family, chosen not for his qualities, but for the alliance his name represented between the Borgias and the Sforzas. The wedding was held in Rome with considerable ceremony and expense. The Borgias understood the difference between display and substance. They were also aware that display, applied with sufficient force, often substituted for it adequately. She moved to Pesaro. The town was small, the court was provincial, and the rooms of the palazzo were cool stone and winter candlelight, a long way from the gilded noise of Rome. Giovanni Sforza was not a man who made demands or impressions. The years she spent in Pesaro were unremarkable by the standards of what followed. She managed the household, corresponded with her family in Rome, and waited, which was, in many respects, the principal skill that the women of her era were required to develop to a high degree of quiet competence. By 1497, the political alliance between the Borgias and the Sforzas had become inconvenient. A new set of relationships was more useful. The marriage needed to end. Rodrigo began proceedings for an annulment on grounds of non-consummation, the legal mechanism that permitted the Church to dissolve a marriage, while maintaining the useful fiction that no marriage had genuinely taken place. The grounds were almost certainly false. Lucrezia and Giovanni had been living as husband and wife in Pesaro for 4 years, and nothing in the domestic record suggests otherwise. Giovanni, faced with a choice between complying and publicly declaring himself incapable of the marriage, chose to fight, which produced the same outcome as compliance, except with considerably more delay, more correspondence, and a clearer demonstration of how little his objections mattered to any party with actual power. He eventually submitted. His response to his treatment was to spread a rumor, specifically, that his wife's father was also her lover. The accusation of incest, once spoken aloud in the echo chambers of Italian court politics, proved nearly impossible to silence. It was repeated, embellished, set down in pamphlets, and incorporated into the standard Borgia mythology, as though it were documented fact rather than the invention of a humiliated man with a strong motive. There is no credible historical evidence for it. There is a considerable amount of evidence for the kind of man who, having been publicly diminished by a more powerful family, manufactures the most damaging possible story about the woman he was compelled to return. Giovanni Sforza was not the last person to do this. He was simply one of the earlier ones. While the annulment was finalized, Lucrezia was kept in a Roman convent, for appearances, or for safety, or both. During this period, she appears to have given birth to a child. The father was never formally established. Rodrigo attributed the child to one man. Cesar attributed him to another. A third attribution circulated through the city, on its own terms. What is clear is that the child existed, that Lucrezia had little control over what happened to him, and that this period of her life was managed by the men around her as a problem to be contained, rather than an experience she was permitted to navigate on her own terms. The annulment was formally granted in December of 1497. She had spent the previous year in a convent, and the years before that in a provincial court, and all of it under the management of men who found her useful in ways that had nothing to do with what she wanted. She was 17 years old. The next arrangement was already underway. The second marriage, in 1498, was to Alfonso of Aragon, illegitimate son of the King of Naples, 17 years old to her 18, and a man who, unlike his predecessor, appears to have made an impression on her that was not purely political. Contemporary letters from the period suggest a warmth between them that the Sforza years had never produced, a mutual ease that people who spent time with them noticed and recorded. He was young, attentive, and, by the standards of the men her family had chosen for her, genuinely present. They shared a household, a child, and a mutual regard that the political machinery of the Borgias had not planned for and did not particularly need. She gave birth to their son in November of 1499, a boy named Rodrigo after his grandfather. The child survived. For a brief period, perhaps the first in her adult life, Lucrezia Borgia appears to have had something that resembled ordinary happiness. In the summer of 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, stabbed by unknown assailants, and carried inside the Vatican to be treated there. Under her care, he survived the initial wounds. She nursed him herself, keeping a watch close enough to his bedside that contemporaries noted she barely slept, that she tasted his food before he ate it, that she had stationed guards at his door, that she was frightened in a way that was openly visible to everyone around her. The fear was not irrational. The Vatican was, in this period, not a place where enemies of the Borgias survived long. Once the Borgias had decided, they were enemies. In August of that year, while she was briefly absent from his room, men entered and strangled him. The official version was that his wounds had worsened. The unofficial version was understood by everyone in Rome within hours. Cesare Borgia was widely believed to be responsible. The motive was straightforward. The Borgias were now aligned with France, and an Aragonese son-in-law was no longer useful. Alfonso of Aragon was 20 years old. Her grief was documented and genuine. She wept publicly, withdrew from court, and refused the consolations that were offered. Rodrigo Borgia, her father, the Pope, reportedly observed that she was taking the loss very hard, and that this would need to be managed, because a third marriage was already being discussed. The word managed appears in the documentary record in the context of her grief, as though grief were a logistical problem, rather than a human response to losing someone she had loved. In the world she inhabited, it was treated as both. The third marriage required considerably more effort than either of the first two. Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, came from one of the most cultivated and established noble families in northern Italy, and the d'Este were not enthusiastic about the proposed alliance. The Borgia name, by 1501, had accumulated a reputation that travelled ahead of it wherever it went. Poisonings attributed and unattributed, murders documented and suspected, the general sense that proximity to the Borgias tended to shorten the lives of anyone who became inconvenient to them. The d'Este wrote letters to each other about the proposed match, with a candour that stopped just short of formal refusal. And Alfonso's father, Ercole d'Este, was reported to have preferred almost any other arrangement than this one. Rodrigo Borgia offered money, a great deal of money. The dowry he assembled for this marriage was substantial enough to address most of the objections that were not strictly theological. And the theological ones, the annulment, the questions about the mystery child, the accumulated weight of the Borgia reputation against the standards of the Church, were managed through channels that the papacy had at its disposal. The match was agreed. A proxy wedding was held in Rome in December of 1501. In January of 1502, Lucrezia left Rome in a procession carrying the full weight of her father's ambitions, and none of her own wishes in any direction that had been asked about. The journey north took several weeks. She was received in Ferrara with the formal hospitality owed to a new duchess, and the careful reserve that a city with any institutional memory owed to a Borgia. Alfonso d'Este received her without warmth and without hostility. He was a man who approached most arrangements, including marriage, as practical matters to be managed efficiently. He was interested in artillery, foundry work, and the improvement of Ferrara's military defences. He was not particularly interested in court intrigues or the performance of feeling. Contemporary accounts suggest that Lucrezia found this, initially, disorienting. She had been trained for a world of calculated charm and elaborate social performance. Her new husband simply wanted the household managed and the duchy administered. The poets and scholars of Ferrara, who would later write warmly about her, kept their distance in these early months. The city observed, assessed, and reserved judgment in the way that cities do when they have been governed well, for long enough to know that new arrivals need to prove themselves, rather than announce themselves. For the first years in Ferrara, Lucrezia existed as a transplant, carrying the weight of her family's name in a court that had not requested it, navigating the formal requirements of ducal life with the composure that had been trained into her since childhood. She gave birth to a daughter in 1502 who survived only a few weeks, and to a son the following year who also died in infancy. The losses were recorded in the household registers with the clinical brevity that the Renaissance applied to childhood death as a matter of statistical frequency. What Lucrezia thought about them is, as with so much of her interior life, not preserved in the documentary record. She managed the household, received guests, attended court functions, and kept the careful account of her own conduct that women in precarious positions learn to maintain as a form of protection. She was watched. Every letter, every court appearance, every relationship she formed was evaluated against the question of whether she was, in the end, a Borgia or simply someone who had been born into that family without acquiring its more dangerous characteristics. Then, in the summer of 1503, Rodrigo Borgia died. The effect on his surviving children was immediate and total. Caesar, whose entire military and political enterprise had been constructed on the platform of his father's papacy, found that platform gone within days. The French connections that had sustained his campaigns in central Italy stopped sustaining them. The lords he had subdued by force stopped accepting his authority. Within months he was isolated, his soldiers unpaid, his alliances dissolved. Within 2 years he was dead in a skirmish in Navarre, 31 years old, having compressed into that brief span more violence, ambition, and historical notoriety than most families accumulate across several generations. Lucrezia, in Ferrara, was not undone by any of this. She grieved her father, wrote letters about it, withdrew briefly from public functions, and then, in the months that followed, began to act like someone who had been released from an obligation she had never agreed to carry. The machine she had been part of since birth had stopped. She was not quite 30 years old. What she did with the freedom this provided was not theatrical. She did not announce a reinvention or make public gestures of distance from her family's name. She simply began gradually and consistently to behave like someone who had decided that Ferrara was where she lived, to build relationships within it that would outlast political arrangements, to make herself useful in ways that had nothing to do with who her father had been. She took on more of the administrative responsibilities of the duchy during Alfonso's increasingly frequent absences, managing military campaigns against Venice, against the papacy, against neighbouring states. Because the early 16th century offered no shortage of occasions for a northern Italian duke to be elsewhere. In his absence, Lucrezia ran Ferrara. She corresponded with governors, managed grain supplies during shortages, adjudicated disputes between the city's merchants and craftsmen, and handled the kind of municipal administration that the historical record tends to undervalue because it does not involve swords or frescoes. The work was unglamorous and substantial. She did it well, and without particular fanfare, which is precisely why it tends not to appear prominently in accounts of her life that prefer the more dramatic element. She survived the pregnancies that the decade required of her. Of the children she carried, several did not survive infancy. One son, Ercole, born in 1508, survived to adulthood and eventually became Duke of Ferrara himself. A daughter, Eleonora, survived to enter a convent. Another son, Ippolito, became a cardinal. The children she lost are less documented, but no less present in the record of those years. Her letters mention fevers, the rapid deterioration of small children, and the flat practical language through which grief, in that era, was most often written down. She also built a court. The Ferrara she had married into was already a cultivated city. The Diesta had been patrons of the arts for generations, and the tradition of literary and artistic support at the court predated her arrival by nearly a century. What Lucrezia added to this tradition was something more personal, the specific, engaged attention of someone who read widely, corresponded seriously, and made the writers around her feel that their work was being received, rather than merely displayed as evidence of her patronage. Among those correspondents was Pietro Bembo, the Venetian humanist, who would later become a cardinal and one of the most influential literary figures of his generation. His letters to Lucrezia, some of them preserved, suggest a relationship that was, at minimum, a close intellectual friendship, and they are revealing in a way that few documents from her life are. In them, Lucrezia appears to be choosing how she presents herself rather than performing a role that someone else had written for her. Ludovico Ariosto, whose Orlando Furioso became one of the defining literary works of the Italian Renaissance, was employed at the Ferrara court and dedicated portions of his epic to the d'Este family. His treatment of Lucrezia was specific and literary, situated within a work that took women seriously as subjects rather than simply listing them among the notable patrons. By the time Ariosto was writing, she had become someone worth engaging with on terms that were her own. The literary culture she built in Ferrara was not an accident of proximity. She had been educated for a court and spent her early adulthood being moved between them without regard for what she thought. In Ferrara she had time, relative stability, and for the first time in her adult life, the freedom to decide what she valued. She chose, it appears, the company of people who made things that would last. Most of the people watching her during those years had been watching for signs of her father and her brother. Few of them noticed what she was building. The years between 1504 and 1519 were, by the standards of her earlier life, remarkably quiet. Lucrezia governed Ferrara during Alfonso's campaigns, raised children, corresponded with poets and diplomats, and built the kind of steady institutional presence in the city that accumulates over decades, rather than announcing itself in any single event. She funded convents and hospitals, wrote letters on behalf of individuals who needed the intervention of someone with influence, and the willingness to use it. She received ambassadors, chaired formal hearings, and managed the ducal correspondence with sufficient competence that Alfonso trusted her to act on his behalf, rather than simply maintain the appearance of governance while waiting for him to return. Her personal correspondence from these years shows someone who had found a settled relationship with her own life. Not a triumphant one, not a happily ever, after arranged for public consumption, but something quieter and more durable, the sense of a person who had decided with the information available to her what she valued and how she intended to spend her days. She wrote about illness with matter, of fact concern, about her children with a particular mix of affection and pragmatism that parents in high mortality centuries learned to maintain, about politics with the engaged intelligence of someone who had been watching it at close range since childhood. The letters are literate, sometimes warm, occasionally wry. They are the letters of a woman who had survived a great deal and arrived somewhere she had not been before, and who found the arrangement, if not exactly peaceful, at least her own. In 1509, during the War of the League of Cambrai, when Alfonso was engaged simultaneously against Venice and papal forces, Lucrezia managed Ferrara through a period of genuine military threat. Her correspondence from these months with the governors of outlying territories, with military administrators, with diplomats attempting to negotiate terms on multiple fronts, is detailed and decisive. She was not playing the role of regent in a ceremonial sense. She was governing, which is a different thing, and the distinction mattered considerably to the people whose livelihoods depended on how well it was done. In her later years she turned increasingly toward religious devotion, wore penitential garments on certain days, increased her correspondence with members of religious orders, withdrew more frequently from the formal ceremonies of court. This has sometimes been interpreted as guilt or repentance, the assumption being that a Borgia who turned devout must have had something dramatic to atone for. It is equally consistent with what happens when someone who has spent the earlier portion of her life as an instrument of other people's ambitions eventually arrives at the portion where she gets to decide what she finds meaningful. In the early months of 1519, Lucrezia became pregnant for what would be the last time. She was 38. The pregnancy was difficult from its earlier stages. She had been weakening through several of the preceding ones, each delivery leaving her slightly less steady than the one before. The Ferrara court physicians noted her condition throughout the spring with the coded concern that appears in medical records of the period when a high-status patient is unlikely to recover. But the record must be kept and must remain composed. In June of 1519 she gave birth to a daughter, who was stillborn. The delivery left her gravely ill, and she died 14 days later. In the days between the delivery and her death, she wrote letters. One was to Pope Leo X Formal, composed, the last of many such letters she had written over the course of her life, to men who occupied positions her father had once held. She thanked him for his affection and expressed confidence in God's mercy, with the directness that sometimes appears in the correspondence of people who know they are dying and have made a decision about it. One was to Alfonso d'Este, who was away on campaign when news of her condition reached him. The letter to Alfonso is often cited. She asked to be remembered as his devoted wife, expressed concern for their children, and wrote with a clarity and composure that people who have not been given a reason to fear death sometimes manage. Alfonso returned to Ferrara after her death, and was, by the accounts of those around him, genuinely bereft. He was not in the public record, a demonstrative husband, not the kind of man who performed his feelings for an audience. But the people who observed him in the months following her death noted something that did not perform. He wore mourning for 2 years. Ferrara mourned publicly. She had been Duchess for 17 years, longer than most of the city's residents could clearly remember a time without her. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini in Ferrara, where her mother-in-law and other DST women had been laid to rest before her. The choice of burial location was her own. The mythology that formed around her name after her death was, in most respects, assembled from materials she had not provided. The poisoning rumours, the incest accusations, the image of a calculating woman moving through the candlelit corridors of the Vatican. These were in circulation during her lifetime, but they were attached to her with increasing specificity and creative elaboration by later writers who found the Borgias a useful setting for stories about power and its spectacular corruptions. Victor Hugo wrote a play about her in the 19th century. Gaetano Donizetti set it to music. In both versions, Lucrezia is a tragedy of her own construction. The historical Lucrezia Borgia spent approximately the first 17 years of her adult life being assigned roles that other people required her to play, and the last 17 years building something of her own in a city that had initially received her with skepticism. The Ferrara years, the administration, the literary patronage, the relationships she formed and maintained over decades, the court she cultivated and the children she raised within it, are not the part of her story that tends to appear in the dramatic treatments, because they do not fit the structure those treatments require. A woman who runs municipal government competently for 2 decades, who corresponds thoughtfully with humanist scholars, who governs during wartime with sufficient competence, that the duchy survives, is not as useful to a 19th century opera as a woman whose moral failures can be set to music. The mythology had staying power partly because it was convenient, and partly because the people best positioned to correct it lacked the institutional means to do so. The Borgia legend was profitable to the writers who elaborated it. It offered betrayal, scandal, poison, and the corruption of sacred office, which are dramatically useful in ways that municipal grain administration is not. Scholarship in the 20th century began the work of separating what was documented from what had been repeated, as though repetition were evidence, and what the documents show is a woman who was used as a political instrument by her family until she was no longer required to be one, and who then proceeded, in the time that remained to her, to live a life more interesting and more consequential than the legend had ever bothered to account for. What her story demonstrates about the Renaissance is less dramatic than the mythology suggests, and more telling. The women who survived the Italian courts of the 15th and 16th centuries, who navigated the marriages, the alliances, the violence, the complete absence of legal personhood, did so not through the villainy that later centuries found entertaining, but through the same combination of intelligence, patience, and institutional competence that has always allowed people with no formal power to accumulate genuine influence over time. They learned to operate within constraints they had not chosen and could not remove. They built within the available space, administered what they were permitted to administer, maintained the relationships that made them effective rather than merely present, and left behind records that are often legible only to readers who know what to look for and where to find it. Lucrezia Borgia was not exceptional in being used. She was exceptional in what she built afterward, and in how quietly she built it. She died in Ferrara on the 24th of June, 1519, 14 days after the birth of her last child, at 39 years old. She had outlived 2 husbands, her father, her brother, and every version of herself that other people had required her to perform. She had governed a city, raised children who survived into adulthood, and came to shape the duchy after her, corresponded with some of the finest literary minds of her generation, and been buried in the place she chose, in the city she had spent the second half of her life making her own. The history is quieter than the legend. It is also more interesting. In the narrow channel between the Greek island of Antikythera and the southern coast of the Peloponnese, in roughly 45 meters of cold Aegean water, a Roman cargo ship had been lying on the seafloor for approximately 2,000 years. It had gone down sometime around the 1st century BC, probably during a storm, in a passage that sailors had always considered dangerous. A stretch of open water where the depth drops quickly from the island's rocky coast, and the wind, in certain seasons, arrives unpredictably and hard from the north. For 2 millennia, no one knew it was there. In the spring of 1900, a small fleet of sponge, diving boats from the island of Simi, returning north from the African coast, were driven to shelter near Antikythera by an unexpected storm. Sponge divers worked at extreme depths in those years using surface, supplied air delivered through rubber hoses from hand, turned pumps on the boats above, wearing weighted copper helmets and canvas suits that were adequate enough to allow dives to 40 or 50 meters, and primitive enough to make those dives regularly fatal from pressure sickness. When the storm settled, one of the divers, a man named Ilias Stadiatis, descended to survey the seafloor near the island, and came up after only a few minutes, shaken, reporting what he had seen below: decomposing human bodies, a heap of them, limbs scattered across the seafloor in the greenish dim light. Captain Demetrios Kondos descended to look for himself, and came up carrying a bronze arm. The bodies were statues. They were statues of such number and such evident quality that when Kondos brought word to the Greek authorities in Athens, the government organized what became the first state-funded underwater archaeological salvage operation in recorded history. For 9 months, beginning in late 1900, divers from the Sponge Fleet worked the wreck site alongside the Hellenic Navy, recovering bronze and marble figures, fine glassware, pottery, ship fittings, and coins. At least 7 large bronze statues were brought up, along with dozens of marble figures, heads and limbs and full torsos, representing a cross-section of Greek sculptural traditions from several different centuries. Among the bronze figures was a bearded philosopher, an athlete in motion, a reclining youth, objects that had almost certainly been standing in Greek sanctuaries for generations before someone stripped them out and loaded them for transport west. The cargo was the portable wealth of a civilization in transit, moving from the places that had produced it to the places that could afford to own it. Among the debris also packed into crates for the Athens Museum was a corroded brown mass roughly the size of a shoebox. It was not obviously interesting. Bronze corrodes underwater into a dense, featureless accretion that reveals almost nothing about the object inside it. And the lump looked exactly like what it appeared to be, a lump. It was set aside among the less remarkable material, catalogued among undistinguished fragments, and examined later, if at all. In the months that followed, as the more spectacular objects from the wreck were cleaned and studied and written about in the Athenian press, the brown mass sat in the museum and dried. Sometime in May of 1902, it cracked open. The archaeologist Valerios Stays, examining the fragments, noticed something that had no business being inside corroded ancient bronze: a gear wheel, cut with sharp, precisely spaced teeth. He reported his finding. Several of his colleagues suggested that the gear had to belong to a later period, perhaps an object that had become mixed into the ancient material after the wreck. The idea that the ancient world could have produced something with interlocking gear wheels of that precision seemed, at the time, implausible. It took the better part of 50 years for the scholarly community to accept that the object was exactly as old as the ship that had carried it. What the Antikythera mechanism turned out to be, after more than a century of analysis by physicists, astronomers, classical scholars, and mechanical engineers using tools that would have seemed as improbable to the ancient world as the mechanism itself seemed to the 19th century, is something genuinely without parallel: a fully functioning analog computer, built from bronze. Gears designed to calculate and display the movements of the sun, the moon, and the known planets against the background of the fixed stars, to predict eclipses with accuracy, calibrated to specific astronomical cycles. and to track the schedule of the major Greek athletic festivals, including the Olympics, across a 4-year repeating cycle. The surviving material consists of 82 fragments, the largest roughly the size of a human hand. Together they contain at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, possibly as many as 37, arranged within a rectangular wooden case and operated by a hand-turned crank on one side. The gears mesh at angles and ratios calculated to reproduce, in the rotation of pointers and dials, on the device's front and back faces, the actual mathematical relationships governing the movements of celestial bodies as observed from Earth. On the front face, a large calendar dial tracked the position of the sun and moon, simultaneously against the Greek civil calendar and the Egyptian zodiac, the two pointers moving at slightly different rates to reflect the real discrepancy between the lunar and solar year. On the back face, two large spiral dials tracked longer cycles, a 19-year metonic cycle, the period after which the phases of the moon recur against the same dates in the solar calendar, an alignment of 235 lunar months to 19 solar years, and an 18-year Saros cycle. The interval, after which eclipses of both the sun and moon repeat in approximately the same pattern. A mechanism capable of tracking the Saros cycle could, in principle, tell its user when to expect the next eclipse of the sun, not approximately, not within a decade, but within a matter of hours, years in advance. The Babylonians had used the Saros cycle for eclipse prediction for centuries before the Greeks. Hipparchus of Nicaea refined it, using Greek geometric methods, to encode it in a rotating bronze dial, geared to a hand crank and marked in days and months, was to make the sky's behavior legible to anyone who could read a pointer. A third smaller dial tracked the exeligmos, a 54-year correction that removed the fractional day accumulating across 3 Saros cycles, and refined the eclipse predictions still further. The gear that tracked the moon's position incorporated something more remarkable. Still, the moon does not travel at constant speed across the sky. It moves faster when closer to Earth in its orbit and more slowly when farther away, a variation that Hipparchus had measured and recorded. To reproduce this variable motion mechanically requires a pin and slot epicyclic mechanism, a gear with a small off-center pin that drives a slotted follower at a rate that varies with each rotation, accelerating and decelerating as the pin moves through the slot. Modern engineers had assumed this particular device could not have been invented before the 16th century at the earliest. The Antikythera mechanism contains one. It works with a precision that modern reconstructions confirm. The inscriptions pressed into the mechanism's surface, many of them legible only through modern imaging technology, engraved in characters too small to read comfortably with the naked eye, form what appears to be a dense operational guide to the cosmos. The text identifies specific astronomical cycles by name, describes the risings and settings of named stars, notes the appearances of the planets and the colours of predicted eclipses, and offers interpretations of what those colours were understood to mean. A small additional dial on the back tracks the Pan-Hellenic Athletic Games on their 4-year schedule, the Olympics at Olympia, the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Nemean Games at Nemea, the Isthmian Games near Corinth. It uses the specific dialectal name forms associated with the traditions of northwestern Greece. What none of the inscriptions contain is a name. No maker is identified. No patron is recorded. The mechanism carries extensive instructions for use, and no account of its own creation, which means that everything known about where it came from is inference, rather than document. The dating of the ship has been established with reasonable confidence. Coins and pottery recovered from the wreck place it in the period between approximately 70 and 60 BC. The astronomical parameters encoded in the gear ratios, the specific values used for the length of the lunar month, the interval between eclipses, the correction factors applied to the longer cycles, correspond most closely to the observational work of Hipparchus, who worked primarily at Rhodes and whose tables formed the foundation of Greek astronomical calculation for 3 centuries. The island of Rhodes appears in the Saros dial as the reference point for eclipse timing. The game-named dialect forms on the Olympiad dial are consistent with a craftsman working in the Greek West. The mechanism carries the fingerprints of a place and a tradition without naming either. The device is the only example of its kind ever recovered from the ancient world. Not a simplified version, not a fragment of something related, nothing comparable, anywhere. Across 2,000 years of Mediterranean archaeology, from the excavated remains of Alexandria to the catalogued contents of hundreds of Roman-era shipwrecks, not one other gear-driven astronomical calculator has been found. Either the Antikythera mechanism was genuinely singular, built once by one workshop for one client and never replicated, or it was one of many such devices, most of which were melted down for their bronze when they broke or became obsolete or fell into the hands of people who needed the metal more than the knowledge. Bronze is infinitely recyclable. A Roman triumphal statue could become a sword blade. A Greek temple fitting could become a ship's anchor ring. When the ancient world needed metal, it reclaimed what it had, which means that the survival rate of any complex bronze object is essentially a function of how quickly it fell beyond the reach of anyone who might have found a use for its raw material. The Antikythera mechanism survived because it spent 2,000 years at the bottom of the sea. Every other device of its kind, if they existed, and the circumstantial evidence suggests they did, was melted down and remade into something more immediately useful. This is not a mystery about what the ancient world could build. It is a mystery about what survives, and why the answer to that question is almost always whatever fell in the water. Cicero, writing in approximately 50 BC, roughly contemporary with the ship's final voyage, described in two separate texts a device he had encountered or been told of, constructed in the tradition of Archimedes of Syracuse, that displayed the motions of the sun, moon, and 5 planets in a turning bronze mechanism. Archimedes died in 2012 BC during the Roman sack of his city, reportedly interrupted in the middle of a geometric proof he asked a soldier not to disturb. The ship carrying the Antikythera mechanism went down roughly a century and a half after him. Whether Cicero was describing a specific surviving device from the Archimedean tradition, a later instrument built in the same lineage, or a known category of object that several workshops across the Greek world had produced at different points, cannot now be determined. What his account does suggest is that the mechanism was not, to the Greeks and Romans of its era, a singular impossibility. It was a known kind of thing. The singular fact from the perspective of history is not that it was built, it is that nothing else survived to say so. Who made it, who commissioned it, and to what purpose? A demonstration of Greek learning for a Roman patron, a teaching instrument for an astronomical school, a temple dedication, a rich man's orrery. Where was it going when the ship went down? The vessel was Roman, the cargo luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean, the probable destination Italy. The mechanism may have been travelling toward a library, a collector's study, a court display. It arrived instead at the bottom of the Aegean, where it lay in the cold and the dark for 2,000 years. Counting. The Antikythera mechanism is not, by itself, evidence that the ancient world was secretly more advanced than historians have assumed. It is evidence of something more specific and more troubling, that a particular tradition of mechanical and astronomical knowledge reached a level of sophistication in the Greek world of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC that was not preserved, not transmitted, and not recovered for nearly 15 centuries afterward. The question it poses is not whether ancient Greece was capable of precision engineering. The mechanism itself answers that. The question it poses is why the capability stopped. Hipparchus of Nicaea, who worked at Rhodes in the 2nd century BC, and whose astronomical parameters appear to be encoded in the mechanism's gear ratios, was one of the most consequential scientific figures of the ancient world, by any reasonable measure. He compiled the first systematic star catalogue in recorded history, quantifying the positions of at least 850 stars, with an accuracy that would not be surpassed until Tycho Brahe in the 16th century. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis over a 26,000-year cycle, by comparing his own observations to those recorded by Babylonian astronomers centuries before him. He developed the first rigorous mathematical models for the motions of the sun and moon, and his methods for predicting eclipses were accurate enough that they remained in use, in modified form, for 3 centuries after his death. The mechanism that encodes his work is, in a sense, his astronomical tables made physical, his numbers turned into bronze ratios, and set in motion by a hand crank. The mechanical tradition capable of building an object that encoded those numbers was equally sophisticated in its own domain. Ctesibius of Alexandria, working in the 3rd century BC, designed a water-powered clock accurate enough to track not just hours but the changing length of daylight across the seasons. A problem requiring a continuously variable mechanism to account for the fact that ancient timekeeping measured hours as equal fractions of the day, meaning that a summer hour and a winter hour are not the same duration when measured against a fixed beat. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century AD, described in surviving texts a programmable rope and pulley system capable of directing a wheeled cart through a preset sequence of movements, a gear-based odometer for measuring distances travelled, a rotating theatrical stage mechanism with automated scene changes, and a steam-powered reaction turbine, the aeolipile, which he apparently considered more interesting as a demonstration device than as a source of useful power. None of these was equivalent to the Antikythera mechanism in complexity. What they establish is that the workshop tradition that produced it did not emerge from nowhere. It was the product of a mature and widely practiced culture of precision mechanical engineering that extended across the Greek-speaking world, and then, with a slowness that makes it difficult to date precisely, it stopped. No single catastrophe explains the loss. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, romanticized in later centuries as the decisive event that severed the ancient world from modernity, almost certainly did not destroy the knowledge that produced the mechanism, because that knowledge was not primarily stored in written texts. It was stored in the hands of craftsmen who had been trained by other craftsmen in specific workshops. A gear ratio can be described in words: the specific material understanding, the feel of the file against bronze, the judgment required to cut a tooth at the correct angle, the practiced sense of when the gear mesh is right, cannot be transmitted through text alone, and does not survive when the lineage of trained hands breaks. When those craftsmen died without successors, or when their workshops were disrupted by conquest, or poverty, or the simple absence of clients willing to pay for objects of that complexity, the knowledge went with them. The Roman world that absorbed the Greek one absorbed its libraries and its philosophical institutions, but did not preserve the specific class of craftsmen who knew how to build a gear-driven astronomical computer. The Romans' engineering priorities lay elsewhere: aqueducts, roads, concrete, the infrastructure of administration. Precision astronomical computation in bronze offered no practical return in a world where slave labor was cheap, and the calendar was managed by priests. The gear-driven clockwork tradition of the Antikythera mechanism would not appear again in the historical record until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe, roughly 1300 years after the ship went down. That is not a gap caused by a lack of interest in the sky or in machines. The medieval Arab world produced excellent astronomical instruments, astrolabes, equatoria, celestial globes of considerable refinement, but not gear trains of the Antikythera type. The medieval European mechanical clock, which appeared in the late 13th century, arose from a different engineering tradition, not a recovery of what had been lost. The mechanism's specific approach, gears encoding astronomical ratios, operating inside a closed wooden case, readable by a non-specialist through its dials, apparently died with the tradition that produced it. Was it the product of a single exceptional mind, or the surviving example of a workshop practice once extended across the eastern Mediterranean? The evidence cannot say. The workshop tradition that produced the Antikythera mechanism did not exist independently of the economic conditions that made precision craftsmanship viable. The Hellenistic kingdoms of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC maintained courts that valued mechanical demonstration as a form of knowledge and prestige, philosophical instruments, astronomical tools, and theatrical automata were funded not by commercial demand, but by the patronage of rulers and wealthy private individuals who understood mechanical ingenuity as a branch of philosophy. Ctesibius built his water clocks in Alexandria under Ptolemaic patronage. Hero's theatrical machinery served the same court culture. The mechanism itself was almost certainly a commissioned object, built for a specific client who wanted to hold the sky in his hands. When the centers of that patronage shifted, when the Hellenistic kingdoms gave way to Roman provincial administration, when the philosophical schools that had housed and funded this kind of work were dispersed or defunded, The specific workshops that had served them did not always survive the transition. The knowledge stayed alive as long as there were people willing to pay for the objects it produced. When those people were gone, the knowledge had nowhere to go. What the ancient world successfully transmitted and what it failed to transmit follows a consistent and revealing pattern. Mathematical texts survived. Archimedes' theorems survived. Euclid survived. Ptolemy's Almagest survived in a form precise enough that medieval astronomers could build on it directly. What did not survive was the practical knowledge that made those theorems physically embodiable. The workshop tradition, the metallurgical expertise, the specific calibration techniques that turned a calculated gear ratio into a functioning bronze tooth cut by hand to within fractions of a millimeter. This asymmetry is not unique to the ancient world, but the Antikythera mechanism makes it visible with unusual clarity. The mathematics that governs the device survived in written form for centuries. The device itself had to wait for a shipwreck and a sponge diver to make it back into human hands. The question of how many similar objects once existed has no answer. The Antikythera mechanism was found because it was on a ship that sank in shallow enough water to be recoverable, near a coastline where divers worked. Bronze that does not end up on the seafloor tends not to survive antiquity. It gets melted down, recast, repurposed for whatever the next era needs most. Any comparable device that remained on land long enough, or that sank in deeper water, or that passed through a different set of hands at the wrong moment in history, is gone without a trace. The mechanism's survival is specific and contingent, dependent on a chain of accidents that could have broken differently at any of a dozen points. The tradition that produced it may have left other objects. If it did, they have not been found. The gap between the mechanism and the next comparable clockwork is not a historical accident, but a historical condition. A reminder that progress is not a river running steadily in one direction, but an archipelago, and that the distance between one island of capability and the next is not always bridgeable by following the current. The ancient world demonstrated, in the specific object pulled from the Antikythera wreck, that bronze gears could encode the motions of the planets with a precision that took modern researchers years to fully map. It demonstrated this once in one object, and the demonstration was then submerged, literally and figuratively. For 2,000 years, this does not make the ancient world primitive. It makes the loss more specific, and in some ways more difficult to account for than a simpler story of progress would allow. The systematic effort to understand what the mechanism actually was began in earnest with Derek de Sola Price, a British physicist and historian of science at Yale, who published a detailed analysis of the fragments in 1974. Price established the broad function of the device and proposed the first detailed reconstruction of its gear train, and his work remains foundational, even though subsequent research has substantially revised and extended his conclusions. The full scale of what the mechanism contained was not apparent until 2006, when an international team, the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, comprising scientists from the universities of Cardiff, Athens, and Thessaloniki, working alongside the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, applied X-ray computed tomography to the surviving fragments and produced three-dimensional images of internal structures that had been invisible since the object's recovery. What the CT scans revealed transformed the interpretation of the device in ways that visual examination of the fragments had never been able to suggest. Previously unreadable inscriptions became legible for the first time, including substantial sections of the operational text covering both the front plate and the back cover. The full extent of the Saros dial's eclipse prediction markers was confirmed. The mechanism did not simply indicate when an eclipse would occur, but marked the type of eclipse, its magnitude, and the colour that the disk of the sun or moon would appear to take on information that the ancient astronomical tradition treated as meaningful beyond the purposes of timekeeping. The Olympiad dial, tracking the cycle of Greek athletic games, was identified definitively from newly readable inscriptions. In 2016, further analysis of the front plate revealed inscriptions describing the movements of all 5 planets known to the ancient world: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, suggesting that the front face of the complete mechanism may have displayed a full planetary model rather than the simpler sun and moon arrangement that earlier reconstructions had proposed. Modern replicas built by mechanical engineers confirm, at each stage of reconstruction, that the device functions as the analysis describes. A full-scale working replica, constructed by British horologist Michael Wright, using bronze and historically plausible manufacturing methods, reproduces the gear train and demonstrates that the pin and slot moon mechanism produces the variable speed its inscriptions describe. A replica built by researchers at University College London in 2021, based on the most complete available reconstruction of the front-face planetary display, showed for the first time how the full planetary dial assembly may have appeared in operation. Neither replica identifies the workshop, neither answers the question of authorship. What they do, with the specific persuasiveness that only a working physical object can provide, is confirm that the device is exactly what the analysis says it is: a bronze astronomical computer built in the ancient Mediterranean before the birth of Christ that worked. What this changes about the history of technology is not a simple correction, but a more fundamental challenge to the assumption that capabilities accumulate steadily and are rarely lost. The standard account of progress, from simple to complex, from ancient to modern, with the Middle Ages as a gap and the Renaissance as a recovery, does not account for what the mechanism demonstrates: that specific technical capabilities can reach genuine sophistication, fail to be institutionalized in ways that ensure their transmissions, and vanish entirely from the historical record. The mechanism does not prove that modernity arrived too late. It raises a harder possibility that something close to mechanical computation arrived in the ancient world, reached a genuine level of precision, was practiced by craftsmen in the tradition of Hipparchus and Archimedes, and then disappeared, not because it was impractical or impossible, but because the conditions that had made it possible stopped obtaining. What would the ancient world have become if that tradition had survived intact? The question has no answer. It is, like the mechanism itself, one of those things that can only be held, turned over, and set down unresolved. The 82 surviving fragments of the Antikythera mechanism are housed today in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, displayed behind glass in a gallery that also contains the bronze statues recovered from the same wreck: the philosopher's head, the reclining youth, the athlete reaching forward. The statues have names now, or plausible identifications. The mechanism does not. It has been decoded in the sense that modern researchers can describe, with considerable confidence, what each gear does and what each dial was built to show. What cannot be decoded is the question the decoding raises. A tradition of precision mechanical engineering that produced this object existed in the ancient Mediterranean, reached a level of sophistication that would not be matched for over 1,000 years, and then, for reasons that no single explanation fully accounts for, disappeared. The mechanism is the only evidence that the tradition existed at all. Without it, the capability it demonstrates would be, to modern history, invisible. One of those things that had to be impossible because nothing survived to say otherwise. In that sense, the mechanism is its own argument, not just a product of the ancient world's knowledge, but proof of knowledge the ancient world was otherwise unable to preserve. The gears no longer turn. The eclipse it was built to predict last has already passed. The eclipse it is calculating next we will see without needing it. But someone, in a workshop in the ancient world, built this so that someone else could know what was coming in the sky. We have their work. We still don't know their name. Frida Kahlo was born on the 6th of July, 1907, in the Blue House in Cayoact. Then, a quiet district on the southern edge of Mexico City, its streets wide enough for the horse, drawn carts that still outnumbered automobiles in the capital. Its garden walls painted the deep cobalt that her father Guillermo had chosen in the years before she arrived. Cayoacan was old. It had been an Aztec city before the Spanish came, and it kept a certain provincial distinctness, even as Mexico City expanded steadily around and past it, the capital reaching outward in every direction, while Cayoacan continued at its own pace. The Blue House sat on the corner of Londres and Allende streets, and it contained, in those early years, 4 daughters, a garden thick with cacti and bougainvillea, and pre-Columbian ceramic figures that Guillermo had collected on his government surveys. A dark room behind the main building where photographs developed in wide flat pans, and the particular atmosphere of a household that was intellectually serious and financially uncertain and shaped throughout by the daily presence of illness. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, had come to Mexico from Germany in 1891, changed his first name from Wilhelm, married twice. His first wife died in childbirth, and built a career as a commercial photographer that eventually led the government of Porfirio Diaz to commission him for a project of national documentation. The systematic photography of Mexico's pre-Columbian architectural heritage, the temples and pyramids and palace complexes that DTIs wanted preserved in glass plates before the modernization. He was pressing on the country, altered, or buried them. Guillermo was methodical and exacting, and he suffered from epileptic seizures that arrived without warning and left him incapacitated for hours. He managed the condition by working alone when he could, and by the kind of preparatory precision that left as little as possible to the unpredictable. He took Frida with him on field surveys when she was old enough to accompany him. Let her observe the developing process in the dark room, the red safe light, the sharp chemical smell, the slow emergence of an image in the developer tray. A pyramid or a carved stone face appearing out of nothing in the pan of solution, and taught her to look at the surface of a carved stone with the same sustained patience his photographic work required. What he was transmitting through the surveys and the dark room and the long hours of waiting for the light to be correct was attention, the practiced discipline of looking at a thing long enough and steadily enough to see it as it actually was, without the distortions that expectation or habit produce. Her mother, Matilda Calderon, was mestiza, of Spanish and indigenous Mexican descent, deeply Catholic and considerably more formal in her expectations than her husband. The household the two of them made was something between a workshop and a convent, intellectually engaged on Guillermo's side, religiously observant on Matilda's, and shadowed throughout by the unpredictable rhythms of his illness and by the financial uncertainty of a career whose commissions depended on a government that was, by the time Frida was old enough to understand politics, in the process of being unmade. The Mexican Revolution began in 1910, when she was 3. She would later claim to have been born that year, a biographical revision she maintained for decades, partly because it aligned her origins with the national rupture that had defined everything that followed, and partly because she understood, precisely and intuitively, what a person's official story was for and what it was not. When Frida was 6 years old, she contracted polio. 9 months confined to her room, while the illness progressed and receded, and when it passed, her right leg was permanently and visibly thinner than her left, with a slight inward turn to the foot that gave her a noticeable limp. The children in the neighbourhood found the name immediately, Pata de Palo, Peg Leg Frida, wooden leg, and it attached with the particular persistence of childhood cruelty that knows it has found its exact point of entry. Her response was physical and deliberate. She swam, wrestled, played soccer, boxed, and built a degree of athletic capability that exceeded what most of the children who had named her managed. She wore long skirts for the rest of her life, wide and layered, and eventually, as her dress sense developed into something more considered and more entirely her own, extraordinarily beautiful. Not to hide the leg, she always insisted, but because what she chose to show the world and what she chose to keep for herself was a distinction she maintained throughout her life on her own terms. And the leg was her business. By 1922, she was enrolled at the National Preparatory School in Mexico City, one of the most academically rigorous institutions in the country, and, as of that year, newly coeducational, 35 girls among 2,000 students. Mexico City in 1922 was, for anyone paying attention, an extraordinary place to be young and intellectually hungry. The revolution had ended only a decade before. The muralist movement was being commissioned onto the walls of public buildings across the city, and the questions of what Mexico was and what it should become were being argued in cafeterias and lecture halls, and the pages of political journals, with the specific urgency that follows a society that has just remade itself and is not yet certain what it has become. She joined the school's most combative student group, a clique called Los Cachuchas, named for the peaked caps they wore, who read voraciously and argued with institutional authority in a manner that stopped barely short of expulsion, and who took seriously the national identity debates being conducted everywhere in the city around them. She was 17, slight, and already in full possession of what would remain her most defining quality. She was completely and non-negotiably herself, in a manner that made alternative interpretations of her difficult to sustain in her presence. Diego Rivera came to the National Preparatory School in 1922 to paint a mural in the auditorium. Frida was among the students who watched him work from the upper gallery. She told her friends she intended to marry him one day. He was 36 years old, already one of the most celebrated artists in Mexico, and enormous in every sense, physically imposing and occupying every room he entered well beyond his actual dimensions. She was 17 and had not yet painted a canvas in any serious way. Her friends found this particular ambition amusing. She let them. On the morning of the 17th of September, 1925, 18 years old, she boarded a wooden bus near the National Preparatory School for the ride home to Coyoacán. The bus was crossing Insurgentes Avenue when a streetcar hit it. The collision was enough to break the wooden frame open along its length. In the wreckage, Frida Kahlo sustained 35 fractures, 3 to the vertebrae of the spinal column, a broken collarbone, 2 broken ribs, the pelvis fractured in 3 places, the right leg in 11 places, the right foot shattered, the right shoulder dislocated. A metal handrail from the bus had entered through her left hip and exited through her right. A bag of gold powder belonging to another passenger, a worker carrying powdered paint, had burst in the crash and covered her, so that when she was found on the floor of the ruined vehicle, her broken body appeared, in the smoke and confusion, to be gilded. A witness later said she looked like a dancer. The handrail was removed at the scene, in the street, before the ambulance arrived. She spent a month in the Red Cross hospital, while surgeries addressed what was most immediately critical, and left the rest to its own timelines. She spent the following year in a full-body plaster cast, lying on her back in the Blue House in Coyoac, immobilized and horizontal, and dependent on the specific patience that a body requires when it is rebuilding itself at its own pace, and no faster. She had practice with long confinement. The 9 months of polio had given her the particular discipline of a body that cannot go anywhere and must find other resources. But the scale of what the accident had left her with was considerably larger than a childhood illness. And the cast year was not peaceful, or comfortable, or manageable in any simple way. What she had in place of movement was time, the blue house, the cobalt wall visible through the window when she could turn her head slightly, the sounds of Coyoac and going about its business outside, and the ceiling directly above her, which she learned the way a person learns anything they cannot avoid. Her mother had a carpenter modify an easel that could be used from a lying down position, and had a mirror fixed to the inside of the canopy above the bed, so that Frida could see herself while lying flat. She asked for paints. She had never studied painting formally. She had drawn since childhood, and had a facility with line and observation that her father's years of teaching her to look carefully had produced. But oil paint and canvas were not tools she had worked with in any serious or sustained way. She began, as the weeks of the cast year accumulated and the world narrowed to what the blue house contained, to paint herself specifically, to learn her own face as a subject, with the same attention her father had brought to temple walls and carved stone faces emerging from their developer trays. Before the accident, she had been enrolled in pre-medical courses, studying toward a career in medicine or biology. The accident ended that particular future with the decisiveness that leaves no room for revision. What it gave her in its place was time, and the mirror, and the paints, and the blue house. Years later, when she had been painting for 15 years, and people asked why self-portraiture appeared across her work so persistently, why her own face and body returned again and again across the canvases, she gave an answer that was brief and exact, and has been quoted ever since. She painted herself, she said, because she was so often alone, and because she was the subject she knew best. In the blue house, lying on her back in the plaster cast, learning her own face from the mirror above her, she was just beginning. The paintings she began producing in the years immediately following the accident were from the beginning, unlike anything being made in Mexico City at the time, not because of their technical sophistication, which was real but not unprecedented, but because of their subject herself, rendered without the adjustments that painting usually makes to bring the subject closer to what an observer prefers to find. The self-portraits she completed during the cast year and the recovery period that followed were built directly from what the mirror above her bed had shown her. Her face, her specific physical existence in the world, the particular quality of her own gaze looking back at her, without softening or idealization, or the translation of direct experience into metaphor. They showed someone who had spent a year lying still in a room in Coyoac, and learning what she looked like, and who had decided that what she looked like was worth painting. In 1928 she brought a selection of her canvases to Diego Rivera, and asked him to look at them honestly and tell her whether they had any serious merit. Rivera was at that point one of the most powerful artistic figures in Mexico, a muralist whose government commissions had made him famous across the country and known beyond it, and whose opinion about painting carried weight that almost no one else she could have consulted could have matched. He looked at the work and told her that she had authentic talent and should continue. By the following year, they were married. She was 22. He was 42. He weighed near 300 pounds and stood over 6 feet. She was slight and barely 5 feet 3, and wore her hair piled high and braided with flowers and ribbons, in the Tehuana style she had begun adopting, as both a visual statement about which tradition she claimed as her own, and as, more simply, what she found beautiful. Their mutual friends called them the elephant and the dove. In the early years of the marriage, they travelled together to the United States, where Rivera had been commissioned to paint murals in San Francisco and Detroit and New York, and where Frida painted in hotel rooms and rented studios. Sustaining the work amid the disorientation of being far from the Blue House and from the Mexico City light and imagery that fed her work most directly. She later described what the marriage cost her with the compression she brought to every subject about which she had strong feelings. She had suffered 2 accidents in her life. She said, one in which a streetcar knocked her down, and the other was Diego. Diego Rivera was constitutionally incapable of fidelity, which was a known quantity before the marriage, and remained a persistent feature of it afterward. He had affairs throughout the years of their marriage with models, intellectuals, fellow artists, and assistants, pursued without particular concern for discretion, and Frida accommodated, and survived, and sometimes matched him. She had affairs of her own, with the photographer Nicholas Muret, with the sculptor Isamu Noguchi, with the political exile Leon Trotsky, whom she and Rivera had taken in and installed in the Blue House. When Diego took Frida's own younger sister Cristina as a lover in 1934, the marriage broke apart in a way that went beyond the pattern they had established. She cut off the long hair. She had always worn braided and braided with flowers, put on a suit, and painted a self-portrait of herself with short hair and scissors, sitting in Diego's oversized clothes in an empty room. They divorced in 1939 and remarried in 1940, under terms that remained their own. What the marriage was, across all of its fractures and recommencements, was the most central relationship of her adult life, and it produced in her work some of the most unflinching images of love and damage that exist in the painting of her century. The other great subject of her painting was her body, not her body as she wished it to be, but her body as it was, injured, pregnant, miscarrying, operated upon, held together by corsets and casts, and the specific stubbornness of someone who had been managing the aftermath of a metal handrail since she was 18. Henry Ford Hospital, painted in 1932 in Detroit, while she was recovering from her second miscarriage, shows her lying in a hospital bed in a pool of blood, holding 6 objects on red threads: the fetus she had lost, a medical pelvic model, a snail, an orchid, an autoclave, the fragments of a broken pelvis that float around her like the elements of a dream she has not been given permission to interpret. The painting is not symbolic in the way that most art about grief reaches for metaphor, because the direct material is too difficult. It is the direct material, arranged with the precision of someone who has decided that the only honest representation of a thing is the thing itself. The broken column, painted in 1944 after a spinal surgery, shows her torso split open to reveal a crumbling ionic column where her spine should be, her body held together by a medical corset, her skin pierced all over by nails. She looks outward from the canvas. She is not asking for pity. When the marriage broke apart for the second time in 1939, she painted what she was experiencing with the same directness she brought to everything else. The Two Fridas, the largest canvas she ever worked on, shows 2 versions of herself seated side by side, one in a traditional Tehuana dress and one in a Victorian European dress, their hearts exposed and connected by a single artery that the second Frida is cutting with surgical scissors. The one in the European dress bleeds. The one in the Tehuana dress holds a small childhood portrait of Diego Rivera. It is a painting about the specific experience of being loved in one form and not another, of watching a part of yourself that depended on another person begin to close when that person withdraws. And it is also, by any formal standard, one of the most accomplished paintings of the 20th century, built with a technical control and compositional intelligence that her years of self-taught practice in the Blue House had produced from nothing. Her political commitments ran alongside her art throughout her adult life, inseparable from both her imagery and her presentation. She had joined the Mexican Communist Party by the late 1920s and remained affiliated with leftist politics, with interruptions and complications. For the rest of her life, she painted portraits of Stalin and Marx. She incorporated the Mexican pre-Columbian past and the colonial violence that had suppressed it into canvases that were simultaneously about her body and about the history of the country she had decided to claim fully and without apology. Her dress, the embroidered Tehuana blouses, the wide-layered skirts, the gold pre-Columbian jewelry, the flowers braided into her hair, was itself a continuous statement about whose visual tradition she belonged to and whose she declined. When the French surrealist André Breton arrived in Mexico in 1938 and declared her work surrealist, she declined the description with the brevity she reserved for categorization she found inaccurate. She had never painted dreams, she said. She painted her own reality. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, her body was failing in ways that the doctors who had been managing the accident's consequences for 2 decades could not fully arrest. She had undergone more than 30 surgeries in the years since 1925, and the collective effect of the operations and the chronic pain they addressed was an accelerating deterioration that left her increasingly confined to the Blue House, increasingly dependent on the medications that kept the pain at a level she could function within. In 1953, gangrene developed in her right leg. The leg was amputated below the knee. Her first major solo exhibition in Mexico opened at the Galería de Arte Contemporáneo in Mexico City in April of 1953, organized by the photographer Lola Ferres Bravo. Her doctors told her she could not attend. The amputation had left her condition unstable, and the outing was medically inadvisable. She went anyway. Her hospital bed was transported from the Blue House to the gallery and placed in the center of the exhibition space, surrounded by her paintings on the walls around it. She arrived by ambulance, was carried in on a stretcher, and arranged herself in the bed wearing her full Tehuana dress, embroidered blouse, layered skirts, flowers braided into her hair, gold pre-Columbian jewelry at her throat and wrists. She received her guests lying down. She drank tequila. She sang corridos with the people who came to stand near her bed and look at the paintings on the walls. The crowd was large enough to fill the gallery for hours, and everyone who attended remembered the specific quality of what they had witnessed. Frida Kahlo, 45 years old, 28 years into the aftermath of the bus accident, the right leg gone, propped up on pillows in the center of her own exhibition in full Tehuana dress, absolutely present, receiving the world on her own terms. In the final years, she kept a diary, part text, part drawing, intimate in a way that her canvases, for all their directness, were not quite. She filled it with observations and fantasies and political declarations, and images of Diego and of her own hands and of the Blue House, writing in the personal cursive she had used all her life, and it records what she looked like to herself in the hours, when she was not composing herself for a canvas or an audience, when she was simply moving through the days with a pen. She kept painting, she kept recording, she kept wearing the flowers. Frida Kahlo died on the 13th of July, 1954, in the Blue House in Coyoacán. She was 47 years old. She had been born in that house, 47 years earlier, in the room with the cobalt walls, and the courtyard where the tropical plants grew in terracotta pots, and she died there too. The official cause of death was pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lungs, the body's final failure after 28 years of managing the accumulated consequences of polio and a bus accident, and more than 30 surgical operations. She had spent the months following the 1953 exhibition in declining health, the amputation's aftermath, and the medications that managed her chronic pain combining into a deterioration that her doctors could monitor, but no longer reverse. Whether the clot that killed her was entirely the body's own doing is a question that several of her biographers have raised, and none has definitively settled. She had access to quantities of medication that exceeded what had been prescribed, and her diary in the final months recorded someone who was fully aware of what was coming and had arrived at a clear position regarding it. Among the last things she wrote was that she joyfully awaited the exit and hoped never to return. She was not someone who wrote things she did not mean. Diego Rivera described her death as the most tragic event of his life. He had been married to her twice, had failed her in the specific way of a person who is constitutionally incapable of faithfulness and knows it and loves anyway. And the 3 years between her death and his own in 1957 were years in which he was, by the accounts of people who knew him well, diminished in some permanent way. Her remains were cremated, as she had requested. Her ashes were placed in a pre-Columbian frog-shaped urn and kept in the Blue House, in the studio where she had worked. In 1958, 4 years after her death, the house was opened to the public as the Museo Frida Kahlo. People have been going to see it ever since, travelling from every part of the world to stand in the courtyard, and in the studio and in front of the mirror, above the bed where she had first begun to learn her own face. At the time of her death, Frida Kahlo was known and respected in Mexico. She had the 1953 solo exhibition, the recognition of Rivera and the broader Mexican art world, a body of work that had been seen by anyone who paid serious attention to painting in Mexico City across the preceding 2 decades. What she was not yet was the Frida Kahlo of international recognition, the painter whose self-portraits sell at auction for prices that rank among the highest ever achieved by a Latin American artist, whose face is among the most reproduced images of the 20th century, whose name is known to people who cannot name another Mexican painter. Outside of Mexico, and the specific circles in New York and Paris and London that followed Latin American art, she was known primarily as the wife of Diego Rivera, a formulation that had attached itself to her throughout her adult life, despite the consistent quality and originality of the work she produced, a positioning the international critical establishment had not yet revised. The revision came in the 1970s. The feminist movement produced a generation of critics and art historians who were specifically interested in artists whose work had been overlooked or undervalued or placed in secondary positions because of gender, and who found in Frida Kahlo exactly the figure that the revisionist project needed. A painter of genuine technical accomplishment and emotional directness, who had been working in the explicit tradition of a male-dominated art world, producing work that was undeniably serious by any formal standard, and who had nonetheless spent her career positioned in relation to a more famous man, rather than in relation to her own paintings. The interest generated by that critical recovery led, in 1983, to the publication of Hayden Herrera's landmark biography, thorough, meticulous, and written for an audience that had no previous framework for either Kahlo's life or her work. And the biography accomplished what a generation of revisionist attention had prepared the ground for. By the 1990s, her paintings were exhibiting internationally to crowds that no gallery had anticipated, selling at prices that established her among the most valuable artists of her century, and her visual image, the strong brows, the flowers braided into piled hair, the Tijuana jewelry, the particular expression she wore when she was being painted by someone she did not entirely trust, had become one of the most instantly recognizable faces in the global visual vocabulary. What her paintings established for the history of art and for every artist who has come after her who needed to paint something true about the body and its experience is the possibility of a direct representation of physical existence that neither aestheticizes suffering into beauty nor reduces it to the spectacle of endurance. She painted 3 documented miscarriages with the precision of someone who had experienced them, and found that experience fully legitimate as subject matter. She painted herself in surgical corsets and plaster casts, and with her spine replaced by a crumbling column. She painted the specific texture of a body that is being kept alive by medical intervention and cannot pretend otherwise. She painted these things without euphemism and without the apologetic distance that most art about difficult subjects maintains between the image and the difficulty. This had not been done before, in painting or in any public visual medium, with the systematic formal rigor she brought to it, and the artists who came after her who needed to work with the material of the body and its specific unglamorous, insistent experiences had a precedent they would not have had without her. Art historians have continued to dispute where exactly she belongs in the larger map of 20th century painting. She is claimed by the surrealists, despite her explicit rejection of the category. She is claimed by Mexican muralism, despite the fact that her canvases operated on a completely different scale and with completely different intentions than the government. Commissioned public walls that defined the movement. She is described as a folk artist in ways that undervalue both her technical training and the sophistication of her formal decisions. She probably belongs to a category. She invented herself a painter who had studied Botticelli and the retablo tradition simultaneously, who had learned anatomy from the surgeries performed on her body, who had spent 30 years deciding exactly how honest it was possible to be on a small canvas in a room in Kayoak theme, and who had found, across the accumulated work of a lifetime spent in chronic pain and continuous production, that the answer was completely. The question of her influence on the painters and photographers and performance artists who came after her is complicated by the fact that she was not widely known internationally until the 1980s, which means that a generation of artists who were working in spaces she had opened did so without knowing she had opened them. Those working in the 1960s and 1970s with their own bodies as formal material, who treated personal and political experience as inseparable, who refused the distinction between vernacular tradition and serious art. They were making arguments in parallel with arguments she had already made, and the retrospective discovery of that parallel has a particular quality. The work confirms the work. What Kahlo gave to the artists who came after her was not a style to adopt. Her visual vocabulary is too specific to her own circumstances for imitation to produce anything except pastiche. But a permission, the permission to treat the direct material of a difficult personal life as fully legitimate subject matter for serious formal work, without mediation, without the apologetic distance that painting about pain had previously maintained between the image and the experience it depicted. She demonstrated through 3 decades of accumulating canvases in the Blue House that emotional directness and formal rigor were not in competition with each other, that the most technically accomplished painting could also be the most personally unguarded, and that the two requirements brought together produced something neither could have produced alone. For Latin American artists specifically, and for Mexican artists in the decades following her death, the permission carried a more precise weight. The muralist tradition had made its argument for the validity of Mexican visual culture at the scale of government walls and public buildings. Enormous, declarative, addressed to citizens in the aggregate. Kahlo made hers on copper sheet, small enough to hold in one hand, in a bedroom in Kayoak, with a brush fine enough to get the individual hairs of an eyebrow. Exactly right. She had put the specific visual vocabulary she had grown up surrounded by, the retablo format, the Tijuana dress, the pre-Columbian objects, arranged on shelves in the Blue House, the color palette of the Kayoakin market and the Oaxacan textile, into paintings that the major institutions of New York and Paris and London eventually placed among the most significant of the 20th century. The argument was not that Mexican art deserved recognition on international terms. The argument was that the terms were insufficient, and that the work she had made, in the specific house where she had been born, and had learned to paint, and had died, was sufficient all on its own. The Blue House has been a museum since 1958, and it remains one of the most visited in Mexico City. People come from every part of the world to walk through the rooms she lived in, the kitchen with the yellow pottery on shelves she and Diego had painted, the studio where brushes are still arranged in glasses on the paint, stained table, the bedroom where the mirror is fixed above the bed exactly where her mother's carpenter fixed it in 1926. The paintings that were in the house when she died have remained there. Others distributed across collections in New York and Chicago and San Francisco, and London travel back periodically for exhibitions that have drawn, on several occasions, more visitors than the institutions hosting them expected to accommodate. The paintings themselves are small. Many of the most famous are less than a foot across in their original form, painted on copper sheet or masonite, during the years when physical limitation dictated scale, on surfaces she could hold or position while lying flat. Reproduction almost never conveys this. In person, the scale recalibrates everything, the evidence of a small brush applied to a small surface, with the precision required to achieve at that scale. The emotional force the paintings carry at any size, the physical record of what it actually cost to make them. She spent 30 years maintaining, through the work and through the specific way she inhabited the world, a version of herself that was not available to be organized into anyone else's categories. Not Rivera's companion, not a surrealist, not a symbol of suffering for other people's purposes, not a regional footnote to a European-centered art history. The maintenance was costly in the ways the work itself records, the surgeries and recoveries, the cast year and the corset years, the miscarriages painted without flinching, the marriage that produced both the most central relationship of her life and some of the deepest damage in it. What she insisted on, through all of it, was the right to be exactly the person the blue house contained, the person who wore the flowers and the gold jewelry and the Tehuana embroidery, and attended her own exhibition on a stretcher and sang corridos to the people who came to see her paintings, and kept painting for as long as she had hands and light and paint. The insistence carried across decades of circumstances that would have given most people adequate reason to stop, produced work that cannot be separated from the conditions of its making, work that carries, in every canvas, the weight of what it cost, and endures because of that weight rather than despite it. The paintings are still in the blue house, still in the museums, still travelling between collections, to be seen by people who come to stand in front of them and understand something about what a human life can insist on and produce. And they are exactly what she made them, no larger and no more forgiving, and no less honest than the person who painted them from a lying down position in a room in Coyoacán, wearing flowers in her hair, with the mirror above her, and the light coming through the window, and the whole long, undefeated work of her life still ahead.